I'm from Penn State University, and I'm hoping by the time I get back, spring will have sprung. We've had a very nasty winter, but I'm hopeful that they'll take care of those things while I'm gone. So I'm going to make just a few key points in my presentation today. And my presentation, I apologize, will be slightly different than the manuscript, the draft manuscript that we submitted. The first point I'd like to make is for both water and sodium, physiological regulation is very elegant, very precise, and that intake of both water and salt and output are well matched, except for those conditions when they're not. I'm going to spend most of my time today talking about that between subject variability that John mentioned in the first talk that ranges depending for intestinal absorption and gastric emptying. John showed values between subjects between 20 and 40% on average. And I'm going to talk about that same variability between subjects with respect to fluid intake, but even more importantly, with respect to salt intake, and what really comprises those very large worldwide salt intakes, up to 10 grams per day worldwide on average now, that were discussed in the first session. And then I'm going to finish my talk today with the issues related to salt sensitivity and sodium intake as a health problem. I'll just start by briefly giving an overview of physiology, and I'm not going to spend much time on this. Homeostasis is well maintained in conditions of fluid gain. We have increased blood volume and arterial distension that creates a cascade of neurohumoral and hormonal responses that decrease thirst, that increase urinary water loss, and increase urinary sodium loss. And as a general theme for this important meeting, I think we all recognize that in most cases, water follows sodium, follows a little bit on the intake side, follows very elegantly on the output side. And then in conditions of fluid loss, we decrease blood volume and blood pressure, turns on a similar cascade of physiological responses that increase thirst, that increase retention of sodium, and obligatory and facilitated water reabsorption by the kidneys as well. And in both cases, homeostasis is pretty well restored on a day-to-day basis. So daily fluid balance, input and output, we get about 80% of the fluid we intake as preformed water, as pure water or fluid in beverages, and about 20% from the foods that we eat. We have a small contribution of metabolic water, as previously mentioned. And then on the output side, we have urine output, fecal losses, and insensible losses through the skin and lungs that can vary quite extraordinarily, especially through the skin, as Ron pointed out, when sweating rates are very high during prolonged periods of physical activity and thermal stress. So in general, to put numbers with those categories above, if we're talking about a total of 2.5 liters per day of fluid turnover, we get 2.2 liters per day from food and drink. We get a small contribution from metabolism. On the output side, 1.5 liters per day cleared as urine, some in fecal loss, and then in almost a liter per day in this cartoon example through the skin and lungs. But people drink and then subsequently excrete different amounts of fluid on a daily basis. So there's variability in water intake that relates to a lot of different factors. I'm going to spend less time on variability in water intake than I will on salt, because a lot of those issues will be covered by Ron when he talks about activity and exercise and so on. But among the things that determine variability in water intake on a day-to-day basis are body size and adiposity, pregnancy and lactation, illness and disease, thermal stress and physical activity as they relate to sweating and metabolic turnover. Culture and habit have already been mentioned quite prominently, and I think that's another recurring theme that will continue throughout the conference. And then I'd like to specifically address the issues of age, because We work with an elderly population in the laboratory. I'm a thermoregulatory cardiovascular physiologist, so fluid and salt turnover is very much of interest, but I certainly wouldn't consider myself an expert on these topics. But we do a lot of aging studies in the laboratory to examine issues of thirst and dehydration in the elderly. And I think there's a lot of myth and misconception related to the healthy, free-living elderly. So just to give you an example, larger people drink more fluid on a day-to-day basis, and for a given body weight, lean individuals take in more fluid on a day-to-day basis simply because the higher the lean body mass, the higher the total body water, the higher the total body water, the higher the blood volume. And so here are a couple studies, including one we did a long time ago, looking at the relation between fat-free mass and blood volume. You'd get a very similar relation if you were looking at total body water. It's important because for a given body weight, if you have more adiposity, you have less blood volume and less total body water. And so any absolute fluid loss represents a larger portion of that vascular space. There are a lot of issues related to healthy older adults and fluid balance. And I've been to a number of conferences all over the world and seen population-based data from dietary surveys that show in a variety of ways that the elderly drink less on a daily basis than they excrete. And I can't tell you how many of those studies I see. They do those studies with dietary records, they do those studies with dietary recall. And of course, the reality is on a daily basis, if we drink less fluid than we excrete, we turn to ash in about 2 weeks. So clearly that can't be the problem. The fact that the elderly somehow have such altered thirst sensations and renal problems that they drink less than they excrete. And in fact, these are some data showing the total fluid intake in young men, older men, young women, and older women. The black bars are total intakes, and then these other bars are various recommendations for fluid intake from the National Health Surveys in the United States and 3 other recommendations. And you can see that regardless of age, individuals do indeed take in fluid, even up into their 70s, 80s, and 90 years of age, provided that they are relatively healthy, provided that they have free access to fluids and the ability to get those fluids and ingest them. And I came across this quote, which I thought was very good as I was reviewing the literature from 2002 that says, "It's difficult to believe that evolution left us with a chronic water deficit that needs to be compensated by forcing a high fluid intake." As John pointed out, on a daily basis, we eat and drink according to habit and other behavioral cues, palatability. We walk past a water cooler. However, as Ron will speak about with respect to exercise and activity, I've added a little caveat to that, which is that that's true at rest. And while Valtine said his quote in 2002, I've added mine just now, for the record. So when we look at variability in beverage type intake, however, this has been alluded to already today, there are many cultural influences. And if you look at various types of beverages as they're consumed in liters per capita, in the US on the left, and then the UK, Germany, Italy, and Finland, you can see quite a few differences. For example, soft drink consumption in the United States is much higher than in those European countries. Milk is consumed more in the US and the UK than the other countries listed there. Germany has much higher beer consumptions, which didn't shock me when I read it. And then, of course, what did surprise me was the high coffee intake in Finland. So there are a lot of cultural and environmental differences associated with the type of beverage intake. We had talked a little bit before the session opened today about defining euhydration, hypohydration, hyperhydration, And I don't think it's important for this group because it's a very knowledgeable group. But I will comment on the fact that when you look at variability in water intake and clearance, on an individual basis, it's easy to look at hydration status and determine for that individual based on osmolar outputs what categorizes euhydration, hypohydration, and hyperhydration. But when we look at group means, samples and large population studies, it's no longer a flat line, but rather some variability. And we can look at standard deviations of those responses on both sides in terms of hypohydration, where milliosmoles per kilogram increase in the urine, and on the hyperhydration side, where urine osmolality decreases. And so while for an individual we can talk about hyperhydration and hypohydration, when we talk about populations, we really should be talking about a relative risk of hypohydration and a relative risk of hyperhydration because of this large between-subject variability in the response. And when studies have looked at variability in water intake and output, for example, the InterSalt study looking at adults, age and sex adjusted estimates of intra-individual reliability for urine volumes ranged only from about 0.49 to 0.57. So within an individual subject day to day. And there's lower within individual variants than there is between individual variants. And of course, those same cultural differences show up here with respect to urine osmolality. Very high in Germany, slightly lower in the US, and fairly low in Poland. Children and adolescents have been mentioned already, and you can see when you look cross-sectionally at a large sample of children and adolescents, urine osmolality averages 742 milliosmoles per kilogram, but with a rather large standard deviation. And between subject variance, again, explains about 34% of the variance in total water intake and output. So I'm going to switch gears now and talk about sodium intake. And of course, there's been an evolution of salt intake from centuries ago when we were hunters and gatherers. And so because of our diet, there was a very low salt intake. As far back as 5,000 years ago, salt was used as a food preservative because that was all that was available. And so there was a relatively high salt intake. With cold storage of food, there was again a decline in global salt intake. And then we've swung back in our industrialized society with a high prevalence of processed foods toward a high global salt intake again. The Institute of Medicine adequate intake and upper limit for sodium chloride, you can see there is 3.7 to 5.8 grams of sodium chloride for the United States at least, which is equivalent to 1 to 2 grams of sodium ion for young adults. And of course, as I go through this talk, everybody here is aware that there's a difference between table salt and sodium as we talk about salt and sodium intake. I may use them relatively interchangeably, but most of the time I'm talking about intake of sodium chloride. Quantifying salt intake is very challenging. There are all sorts of problems inherent in dietary questionnaires. Urinary excretion is more accurate, but of course urinary excretion reflects recent salt intake, not chronic or lifetime salt intake. And then finally, obviously, there's been a worldwide alert with respect to the health risks associated with the high salt intake, primarily related to hypertension, but also related to such things as kidney stones, osteoporosis, stomach cancer, type 2 diabetes, and so on. So it's important to understand, if we want to lower salt intake worldwide, it's important to understand why there's such variability in salt intake currently. And I'm going to go through a variety of determinants of salt intake that add up to that total variability. The first of which is oral sensory phenotypes. That is, why does salt taste good to some people and not others? There are two common phenotypical markers for variation in taste and oral sensation that are used in a variety of studies, not just for sodium intake. One of which is the perceived bitterness of propylthiouracil, or PROP, very common for taste studies of all sorts. And then there's another, which is the density of fungiform papillae on the tongue. And so individuals who have a higher perceived bitterness of PROP describe more liking of foods and drinks as they become saltier. And so those individuals have an increased salt intake. Similarly, a lower density of these papillae on the tongue are associated with an increased preference for high fat and high salt foods, which also leads to an increased salt intake. And so these oral sensory phenotypes influence salt intake only indirectly through liking or having positive affect related to the taste of salt, where salt sensation increases the liking of salty foods, which in turn increases intake of sodium. Somebody mentioned in the first session twin studies and genetic influences on gastric emptying and intestinal absorption. Probably the best study of the variability in salt intake from a genetic standpoint is the Korean Healthy Twin Study, which started in 2005 and continues today. You can see that this is a number of individuals, of which 133 monozygote twin pairs, 29 dizygotic twin pairs, and so on with non-twin siblings and parents and their spouses. And this study is based on half-day urine collections. They do a lot of work to validate half-day versus full-day urine sampling and include questionnaires and 3-day dietary records. If you look at the interclass correlations for things like total sodium intake adjusted for calories in the diet, and then salt habit questions, for example, how salty do you perceive your daily diet to be? Several patterns emerge, one of which is these things are more closely related among identical twins than they are among non-identical twins. However, there's still a pretty high relation in these intake variables with respect to twins that are not identical but spent time in the same uterus, the same womb, much higher than for non-twin siblings. The other thing that's interesting is a fairly high correlation between spouses. Additionally, there was no concordance between urine collection data and dietary survey. Again, problematic issues related to asking people to recall in their diet how much sodium, or how much of anything for that matter, they took in. Men take in more salt than women, whether as a total salt intake or adjusted for kilocalories. Younger subjects rated their diets as more salty, and there were no differences by income level. So the conclusions we can draw from this sort of twin study are that there's a moderate genetic influence because identical twins are more closely matched in terms of their sodium intake than any other familial relationship. That shared environmental effects play a role because spouses are more closely matched than sibs or any parent and offspring relations. And then there's probably an influence of early stage development. The surprising part of this study is the dizygotic twins and their relation in terms of sodium intake. Those share a uterine environment or are closer in terms of their early stage neonatal development than other siblings are. So in summary, genetic predisposition plays an important role in both sodium intake and salt habits, but again, only explains a very small percentage of the variability. So what about environmental factors? The question to be raised here is, do humans actually have a salt appetite? And you'll see from the bottom right of this study that from a purely biological standpoint, our biological friends would say that humans don't have a traditional salt appetite. Animals love salt. Humans reject pure salt. For example, you don't see many of your colleagues out at salt licks with rock salt. If you put it out in the yard, your neighbors don't come, but deer and rabbits and other animals show up. And while the iron is essential for both animals and humans, humans will only ingest sodium chloride, at least if they have the choice, whereas animals have a pure sodium appetite. Our appetite is for table salt. Most animal species will ingest almost any sodium salt. And humans don't respond spontaneously to an acute sodium deficit by seeking salt. Animals respond with a robust sodium hunger. And one other difference is that humans only eat salt with food and reject it in fluids, unless it's kept in very, very low concentrations, for example, in sports beverages, and then it tastes better to people when they're hot and sweaty during and after exercise. So those are some environmental factors. There are also developmental factors. In rats, for example, you can create a lifelong sodium appetite by depriving adult rats of sodium in their diet for a period of time. You can't do that in humans once we're adults, but you can do it before we're born and immediately after we're born. So for example, there's some indication that prenatally maternal vomiting, which results in low sodium, increases long-term sodium appetite and reduces the sodium taste threshold in infants at least through early adulthood. Similarly, if you take neonates and give them diuretics that create a low serum sodium, they have increased dietary sodium intakes from age 9 to age 22, which is the period of time that this study followed them. Similarly, in infancy, large episodic vomiting and diarrhea leads to an increased sodium intake from the time they're older children through late adolescence. However, by the time we get to childhood, it really becomes a learning process in terms of sodium intake, watching their parents salt their food, having salt on the table, and so on. But by the time we get to adulthood, there really aren't a lot of things with respect to physiology that have an effect on the amount of sodium that we take in. So variability in salt intake, similar to variability in sodium intake, obviously has many cultural factors. You can see here information from the INTERMAP study by the World Health Organization that shows in both men and women, these are aged 40 to 59 years, if you look at dietary sodium intake, it's very high in the northern part of China for both men and women, low in South China, very high in Japan, and then moderate in the UK and in the United States. And if you look at the variability in salt intake, if you look at European and North American countries, sodium intake is dominated by sodium that's added to processed foods. And in particular, cereals and baked goods, grain-based products, are the largest contributor. 38% of the salt intake in the United Kingdom, for example, comes from processed foods related to cereals and baked goods. Meats and processed meats are the second largest source. That's 21% of the sodium intake in the UK, with only 10 to 12% naturally occurring in foods, and surprisingly to me, only 10 to 12% from salt added during home cooking or sodium added at the table. If you contrast that to Asian countries, in China, salt added to home cooking, salt on the table and soy sauce are the greatest contributor. Processed foods, not so much. In Japan, similarly, soy sauce, salted fruits and vegetables, miso soup, fish, etc., contribute those large amounts of sodium to the diet. The lowest recorded intakes of sodium are a tribe of Indians in Brazil that have intakes as low as 0.05 grams to 0.06 grams of sodium chloride per day. Back to our ancestral roots. So last, I want to talk about very briefly the issue of salt sensitivity, because we wouldn't really care much about worldwide sodium intakes if it wasn't such a health risk, or at least a perceived health risk. And the issue that's most predominant when we talk about health risks is hypertension, and whether or not, for some or all individuals, cutting down on dietary sodium intake leads to a lower risk of developing hypertension. So almost half of the US population has hypertension, salt sensitivity, or both. And salt sensitivity is defined by a transient increase in blood pressure after eating a high salt meal. So for example, if you look at the hypertensive group, which is about 30% of the population in the United States, shown here by this red rectangle, you can see that it's relatively large. But when you overlap that with salt sensitivity, which is about 25% of the population, only half of the salt-sensitive individuals are hypertensive and salt-sensitive, whereas the other half are normotensive but salt-sensitive. So these people have not developed and probably don't have a higher predisposition for developing hypertension with a high salt intake, but these individuals do. And so the question then becomes, can we identify these individuals and distinguish them from these individuals? And therein lies a good bit of the problem. So the relation between salt intake and cardiovascular risk isn't linear, but it fits a typical J-shaped curve, where a low-salt diet may not be beneficial to everyone, and in some individuals, it paradoxically increases blood pressure. So if you look at salt intake, we can divide that to high salt and low salt. These individuals who are paradoxically salt sensitive can be divided into normal blood pressures and high blood pressures. Salt resistant, 72%. Some of them have normal blood pressures and some of them have high blood pressures. So it's kind of a mixed bag and very difficult to distinguish because it's not a particular phenotype. You can see here systolic sodium sensitivity and diastolic sodium sensitivity in these two frequency domains. And you can see that this is 0. This is an increase in diastolic blood pressure or an increase in systolic blood pressure after eating a high salt meal, or a decrease in systolic or diastolic blood pressure after eating a high salt meal. And so it's not a yes or no, all or none response. Some individuals, many individuals, will increase their systolic or diastolic blood pressure 5 to 10 to 15 millimeters of mercury after the intake of a high salt meal, but it's highly variable. There's a genetic component because there's a higher history of familial hypertension in people who are salt sensitive, whether that individual is hypertensive and salt sensitive or normotensive and salt sensitive. There's still a higher incidence of hypertension in the family. It's more frequently seen in those of African origins, and there's a sex by race interaction more prominent in women than in men. And this salt sensitivity is derived from an unclear origin, but rather than being the intake side, it probably reflects an increased renal reabsorption of sodium. And then finally, I'll just mention before I stop talking that a lot of work has gone into looking at the variability in salt intake, blood pressure, and genes, and there have been a large number of genes that have been examined in gene families, and I've just listed some of them here with respect to the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. A lot of work went into looking at the angiotensin-converting enzyme dimorphisms, and that's probably not related to salt sensitivity, but angiotensinogen differences may be. There are differences that have been identified between salt-sensitive and salt-insensitive individuals with respect to renal ion transporters, alpha-adductin that influences the sodium-potassium ATPase pump, endothelial cell genes because eventually increases in blood pressure in salt-sensitive individuals cause initially endothelial dysfunction that after vascular remodeling leads to frank hypertension, other sympathetic nervous system genes, and dopaminergic system genes. So a lot of work going on in this area now, no clear-cut distinctions, but a lot of possibilities. And so I'll stop there and we can start a discussion.
Thank you, Larry. I'll once again give Susan the chance to open the discussion, if that's okay with you.
I'd like to point out the nepotism associated with this meeting, the fact that Susan always gets to open the discussion.
I thought you were going to say the fact that you were invited. Again, I would hasten to say, against the advice of many people.
Yeah, that's not nepotism. That's just a bizarre coincidence.
Sodium versus salt. You use them interchangeably there. Mm-hmm. Where are we in terms of our understanding of the science? How important is the accompanying anion? Do we have a good picture? I guess specifically for today, thinking about how it may influence hydration.
Yeah, that's a very good question. As I pointed out, when we deal with human studies, we almost always use the sodium ion and sodium chloride analogously, because sodium chloride is really the only salt of sodium that we take in large quantities. But the chloride ion certainly plays a role in terms of its transport, in terms of other mechanisms associated with it in the kidney and in the gut. I don't know all the nuances. It is important, but it's probably not important with respect to salt sensitivity and development of hypertension. But in terms of the fluid intake side, fluid follows sodium chloride, with both ions being important.
Okay. Yep. And sticking with ions, potassium and its role in attenuating the blood pressure response in salt-sensitive individuals. Where has the science got to that, and how significant an impact can it have in effectively reducing concern over those individuals who are salt sensitive?
I don't know that there's any clear evidence that that potassium plays a beneficial role, other than obviously people have tried to market non-sodium table salts with potassium chloride and so on, which have a very distinctively different taste, and people tend not to like them. So with respect to trying to substitute potassium for sodium in the diet, that would be the one thing that would influence both fluid intake, well, probably not fluid intake, but because everything related to potassium chloride is taken with meals typically, but with respect to the hypertension issue. So I don't know of any, and maybe other people do have an idea of whether or not there is good scientific data that substituting potassium for sodium has a direct influence.
But rather than substituting it, adding it into your diet as well, so you could still have your very high salt intake, but putting in some potassium there.
I have not seen anything along those lines that show that adding potassium to the diet downplays or offsets any of those sodium-related mechanisms.
Okay.
Addressed exactly that question, which gave potassium as a supplement in hypertensive people and demonstrated a modest rise in potassium and a modest drop in blood pressure with other intakes unchanged. So that's always been another argument for the potassium intake thing. But I don't know, it's a relatively small study, and I don't know big population studies that have followed up on that.
Yeah, I remember seeing that study, and I think the changes in blood pressure were relatively modest. And it always surprised me that that study wasn't followed up on if there were a real physiological mechanism underlying it.
I've got it in front of me. It's a 5 millimeter mercury drop over 6 weeks of added potassium. That's the normal.
It's systolic or mean pressure?
Those are, it looks like systolics, but I'm just looking at something in a book chapter.
Thanks, Ari. Louis Sardinia sent a couple of comments and asked if I would raise them. And one of his comments follows on from some of the things you said towards the end there, and that is the fact that hypertension is fairly common, and there seems to be a rush to medication in the medical fraternity when it's diagnosed. What are the implications of most of those medications, which operate by different mechanisms, on maintenance of hydration and salt balance?
I think there's a rush to medications for the same reason there is a rush to find the exercise diet pill, because it's easy. For most people with low levels of essential hypertension, weight loss would be the best management paradigm, and weight loss coupled with exercise would certainly play that role. But of course, when we start to talk about all of their various classes of medications associated with hypertension, now there are so many combination medications that typically start with a diuretic and then add on some direct cardiovascular type of drug. I think with respect to the diuretics, most of the common diuretics used today are potassium-sparing diuretics, so I don't think that's as big an issue as it once was. I think it speaks to the issue of hypertension in the elderly with respect to other cardiovascular problems. But I don't know that those medications play a major role in any way, shape, or form, other than the diuretics perhaps, with respect to hydration and with respect to salt balance.
Thank you. One of the questions you asked too is that when we experience thirst and we take a drink, we can make many different choices. And what are the major implications of those different choices for hydration? If we choose, say, a high sugar beverage versus a water beverage versus a beverage that's got significant salt, for example. Mm-hmm. And people forget how much salt there is in milk.
Yeah, exactly. What are the implications with respect to general health?
Well, firstly to hydration.
Yeah.
How does it influence the volume that's likely to be consumed? And then secondly, what are the longer term if that becomes a chronic behavior?
Yeah. On a daily basis in the unstressed condition, as John pointed out earlier, we drink because of habit, we drink because of behavior, we drink primarily with meals. So you get these spikes of fluid intake with meals if you look over the course of a day. And those fluid intake choices are driven primarily by palatability. What sounds good to us at that particular time, whether we choose water or milk or soft drinks or beer with our food, is a palatability issue. I think the confusion in the literature comes from recommendations worldwide of things like drink 8 glasses of water per day, where water is purely defined as only water, forgetting that other beverages contribute primarily to that daily fluid intake as well, because they're comprised 95 to 99% of water anyway. So I think with respect to hydration, I think all those fluids are important. I think they're all primarily influenced day in and day out by palatability. Palatability changes with things like exercise and thermal stress, such that saltier drinks are more palatable when our core temperature is elevated and we've been exercising and sweating. So that's a very modest indicator of some sort of sodium appetite in humans. But day in and day out, we don't have that drive to ingest sodium, for example.
Yeah, I've got mixed feelings on those comments you made about the drive in humans. Now, I've read the literature, but I've also observed people. And if you put people on a high carbohydrate diet, which tends to be a fairly low salt diet, as we prescribe that high carbohydrate diet, they do develop a craving for things that are savory and salty. Mm-hmm. And so after a few days, there does seem to be a feeling that something is missing from the diet. And that something seems to be, at least to some extent, salt.
But the real question then becomes, is that physiological or is that habit and taste-based? So that if you put somebody on a low sodium diet, the food no longer tastes good to them.
Isn't that what a sodium appetite is?
Well, biologically, sodium appetite means craving sodium in any of its forms. So you would drink a salty solution. But with humans, it's very much selective in terms of sodium. First of all, only sodium chloride. Second, only with food, not in drinks. So that's the way it differs from a sodium appetite, which is why I return to the issue of food palatability, and in some cases, drink palatability. And whether or not some of the things that you just mentioned have to do with the fact that if you put people on high carbohydrate diets, first of all, the food doesn't taste good in general because they're missing the fat content that makes food taste good. And secondly, because when it's low sodium, it's not surprising that they add more sodium or crave more sodium to make foods over the course of the day taste better.
And certainly from my own experience, I would say if I exercise hard in a hot environment, lose a lot of salt, I automatically put salt on food even before I taste it.
So if you do that before you taste it, it's a behavioral choice.
It's a behavioral choice,
Right.
and that's the point I'm trying to make.
Right.
It's often,
Sodium is, isn't it?
Yeah.
well, but you know from experience, from previous exposures, that you need to do something, and that something is to put more salt on the food, because you do it, and I speak to athletes, and I watch athletes, and athletes do that. When the sweat losses are high at a training camp in warm weather, you see them reaching for salt, putting it on the food, which you don't see to the same extent training at home. So it is to a large extent a learned response. It's a recognition that this is something you need to do.
At dinner last night, I asked Susan to turn away several times while I reached for the salt shaker before I tasted things and dumped lots of sodium on. So for me, it's a cultural thing growing up, in terms of growing up in a family that salted foods a lot and used salt at the table, watching my father and mother do it. And now my children do it as well, which is a little bit scary because I have great genes, and so I know my blood pressure is normal.
And that's one of the things that also scares me a little bit. We've come to a situation where there's a stigma associated with putting salt on your food at the table, because we've been educated to believe that this is something we shouldn't do. Yeah. But if my salt losses are high because I'm active and I'm not hypertensive, why shouldn't I put salt on my food?
The bottom line is it's a behavior that some people shouldn't do.
Yeah, exactly.
And because we can't identify who those people are by giving them a simple test, or even by giving them a high salt meal and monitoring their blood pressure response after, because that's so highly variable. The safe route is to say, everybody cut down, because our physiological needs on a daily basis are probably on the order of 2 grams per day. And yet, worldwide, we're probably at 10 grams per day, trying to cut down to 6. So there will be plenty of salt excesses, even if we somehow force people to adhere to those low sodium dietary recommendations.
What is the reaction of the newborn child to salt?
To dietary salt?
Is it a preference? I mean, they like sweetness. Do they like salt?
I don't know. I don't know. Don't know if those studies have been done.
Question of age, if I may answer the question. Because, you know, in the first 3-4 days, they have to lose an isotonic fluid, about 10% of body weight. And later, their kidney functions relatively, so they have a GFR less than 20-30. So they work much less than our kidneys. So they can get rid of the salt very difficultly. So that's why we don't give high amount of salt. So all the feedings, the formula milks and mother milk contain very low amount of salt. So for the
that facial expression, because that's often how people judge liking or dislike.
So they dislike salt, I think, but we have never tried actually. So they don't need high amount of salt. They need I think this is a question of the ratio of salt intake and water intake. For the caloric needs, they need higher amount of fluid and a constant amount of sodium, low amount. So very low concentration of sodium in a high amount of water. That's why we don't need to add extra sodium chloride to the newborn's feeding.
Yeah, but I mean, if you look at levels of sweetness, children obviously like sweetness. They're born with a genetic preference for sweetness, and that's the question, not whether they need it, but whether they like it.
Does that relate to breast milk characteristics?
Yeah, well, breast milk is sweet.
Yeah, as opposed to salty, although it has sodium. I think it was fascinating to me another distinction between the rat studies on sodium intake, which show that if you can take an adult rat and take as much of the sodium out of their diet as you can for a period of time, and you can lead in a young adult rat then to almost a lifelong craving of salt or more sodium intake for a long period of time. In humans, we can only do that, or it's only been shown, to occur in the first few months and maybe up to a year of life. That if there's sodium deprivation in a variety of ways, from maternal vomiting to infant diarrhea and so on, you can at least track a higher sodium intake into their early 20s in those individuals. But if you take an adult, put them on a low sodium diet, that doesn't increase their intake subsequently, all other things being equal.
Well, thank you. It was always difficult to assess the salt intake. In surveys, nutritional surveys, it was a weak point.
Mm-hmm.
The sources of salt, as you put for the UK, but we have for Central Europe, similar picture. So it is bread and bakery products, meat products, sausage, cheeses, different cheese, different sorts of cheese, and about two-thirds of the salt intake we get from the processed foods, convenient products.
Right.
Therefore, it was always difficult to assess the salt intake in nutritional survey. Because also the added salt, as you mentioned in your comments, is very difficult to quantify. Therefore, we have been very lucky for the proposal to assess sodium excretion in urine and related to the, retrospectively, to the salt consumption. Although you said it reflects only the recent intake.
Relatively recent.
Relative.
Yes.
But I can overcome this problem by repeating the collection of urine over 24 hours, not relying only on one day urine, and assess sodium excretion and calculate the sodium intake. I think this proposal is also followed now by the US, and we are doing this in different countries in Europe.
Right.
Is that a method we could recommend to be used?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the correlation between dietary records and urine osmolality or urine sodium excretion are very, very low, 0.06 in some surveys. But I think the collection of 24-hour urine samples repeatedly over a period of time to characterize sodium intake, for example, periodically in individuals is certainly probably the state-of-the-art approach in large population studies right now.
Yeah. We just finished a study in Palestine with UNICEF, also looking at this point, so iodine status, iodine coming from iodized salt, and that was a method we applied to 2,400 school children, and it showed a very, very interesting picture. So from the calculation from the food database compared to the sodium excretion, it was nearly double the amount of salt we calculated than taken from the food composition table.
Yeah, I don't want to offend my dietitian friends, but I think there's a lot of problematic data in the literature from our reliance over the past 20 or 25 years on dietary records and dietary surveys, whether they're 1-day, 3-day, or 10-day dietary records, because of really the limited ability to back that up with the physiology of what's really going on.
From the 24-hour recalls for the diet, so a repeated recall, say so twice at least, is recommended, and it is enough. But it should not be exaggerated by doing it every week and doing it 6-7 times per month.
Yeah.
I think the repeated 24-hour recall, so for solid diet, for the total diet intake is enough. But for salt, exposure to salt, we collect 24-hour recall only once, and calculate the salt intake, believing that there is a steady state in the body for the sodium and salt intake and excretion.
Absolutely. I didn't mean my comments about dietary records were meant to, with respect to the sodium characterization, not other macronutrients and things in the diet.
But we should recognize too that active individuals can lose 6 grams of salt in 1 hour's exercise in the sweat, which of course doesn't appear, and that even emphasizes the difference between the dietary record result and the actual sodium intake.
Those are not the rule, they are the exceptions.
They're the exceptions, but if you can lose 6 grams in an hour, then how much do you have to lose to have a significant impact? Does 1 gram make a meaningful difference when we start to consider things? If you have 10% of your population losing 1 gram or 2 grams in sweat over the whole 24 hours, this is 6 grams in 1 hour. It's quite easy to lose during exercise. So some people could easily lose that over 24 hours without large amounts of activity, without large amounts of sweating.
Individuals with moderate exercise, they don't lose so much. So
That's not in all cases particularly strenuous exercise. That's football players training, which is not
for the
which
general
is close to being
population. So,
sedentary.
to put a recommendation for the
Yeah,
general population.
but I think what I'm saying is we have to recognize that in any large population there'll be some individuals who are active in a warm environment who will be sweating salt, which will distort the relationship. And that's just a slight qualification.
And that creates its own inherent variability because a lot of scientific investigation has gone into trying to determine predictors of salty sweaters and genetic variants and phenotypes associated with high sodium emitters in sweat as well.
So we have Richard, and then Ian, and then Hans on the list for questions, and then Maria.
Okay, there are two very interesting questions for me. One of them you mentioned is the difference between intake and output. And when you think about the maximum concentrating capacity of the kidneys, it is 1200 milliosmoles per kilogram. Mm-hmm. Half of this is usually urea. So you will have on the limited amount of sodium removed in the highly concentrated urine. It is far less than what you eat normally, so you need more water, obviously, to excrete all the sodium that you eat. And this can be calculated for amount for 12 grams or something like 3 liters of water is needed. Also, you see this in the clinical environment when you stop really reabsorption by furosemide, giving furosemide, and the concentration of sodium in the urine is something like 60 millimoles per liter of urine. So we need to drink to excrete all the sodium. Yes. The problem is when you give intravenously sodium chloride, you can't see any changes in sodium concentration, you can't see any sodium, the changes in blood pressure, but the sodium doesn't appear in this amount that you have given intravenously in the urine. It disappears somewhere. It's not only in diet, it's also in clinical, very well-controlled situation. Where it goes, well, this is the question. As we know about the glycosaminoglycans that bind it somewhere in the skin, but is it really true? And this is one thing. The other thing is the chloride. It's very interesting because when you see this fine affected sodium in salt increases blood pressure, you can't see this when you give sodium bicarbonate intravenously again. So it is a difference between which anions are given, and we really cannot say this small amount of water that you drink is okay, and I don't think it is right to say we are not made for drinking a lot of fluid, but because we will be not healthy. We are not also planned to live that long as we do, and we eat the salt, and we accumulate it somewhere in the body. Could you just give some light on this?
I didn't say we weren't meant to drink large volumes of water. Another individual mentioned that. So, no, your points are well taken, and in my comments and what will be in my rewritten paper, because of other presentations at this conference with respect to renal function and clinical populations and exercise, I stayed away from those particular instances, but your points are very well taken.
We have Ian next.
The issue about dietary intakes or dietary surveys is you're absolutely right. I mean, the UK approach to this is called the National Diet and Nutrition Survey, where we have been measuring sodium excretion, and yes, there'll be some extremes, but you know, in general population, they're irrelevant. And it's that sodium excretion that the target for salt reduction is based on.
Correct.
And the effectiveness is evaluated by how much it's coming down. If you look at the intake, you can forget about it, because a subgroup of the NDNS actually has the doubly labeled water for energy expenditure done on it, and the energy intake is in error by about 15% on average, under-reporting. And that's just the energy, so goodness knows what the minerals are. But it's the urinary excretion that is used. Now, clearly that could be in error because of surface losses, but that is what's actually used. And that is what shows that there is a higher excretion in men than in women, which is what you'd expect. What was strange about one of your tables, the one that had North China and South China, Japan, UK, and the US, was that the men and the women were identical. And the excretion, or the sodium levels, were much lower than I would have expected. So I think that was a WHO review, but that table just looks funny.
Yeah. I don't remember that table, but we can go. I think the women were slightly, but not.
That one.
Yes.
So the women are a bit higher in Japan.
Yeah.
Okay, and in the UK they're a bit higher, but this is 1,600 milligrams of sodium, which is nonsense because it's about 4,000. 3,000 to 4,000. It's not so. What I didn't understand was the internet. Yes, it's WHO study. So I just didn't understand what and where on earth those data came from, because that's not the UK numbers, and I'm sure it's not the US numbers.
No, I just wanted to represent the fact that China and Japan were higher, but I originally had a world map in there that showed those higher values in the 4,000 range, different colored countries for different amounts of sodium intake, and I took it out at the last minute. But that'll certainly be corrected when I put together the manuscript.
I see it's sort of younger adults if you're Ron and me, or older adults if it's the rest of you. But it may well be it's an age-related thing. But my recollection of the UK data was it's the older people who actually have the highest salt intake.
Right.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, I was puzzled as well when I saw the absolute values here and the absolute values that I saw in NHANES and the UK data, and then the intermap studies are much, much higher.
Yeah, so I have one short comment, or just check the literature. I found 40 milligrams of sodium in breast milk per 100 milliliters, so it's quite low. It seems that it's not a big thing, that glucose or energy is much more important. But coming back to the dietary surveys, I think it's not only that we do not get the data, how much salt the people use. I think also a problem is the database itself. If we go for a restaurant and I think in Germany we have the food database with about 15,000 different foods, but what kind of food do I have to select to find the right one which the person was eating? And then we have recipes. Every restaurant is different. So therefore, do you think we underestimate or overestimate, or we just don't know how much salt people eat?
I think we just don't know from dietary records. Yeah. And I think the most glaring example of that is the fluid intake one that I started with, which is, it's several organizational meetings I've sat through and listened over and over to Dutch studies, Polish studies, Chinese studies, that all show that if you ask older individuals and you do very complex dietary surveys of free water, other beverages, try to calculate the fluid content in food, they always take in less every day of their lives than they excrete. And somehow they're still alive and walking around. So I think that's a very good point, but I don't know if it's always underreported, always overreported for sodium, or it's just a mixed bag where they just don't match up.
And a second question for the recommendations in terms of fluid intake, for example, is by the EFSA, it's 2 liters to 2.5 liters. We have a sodium recommendation or a maximum we should have for, in Germany, I think it's 500 milligrams, Ibrahim. Yeah. And so this is total amounts, but when we're talking about not athletes, but the general population, to my idea, the general population is between 50 kilograms for adults and let's say 150 plus and much more. So do you think it's a possibility to express the recommended intake in water and also sodium per fat-free mass, for example, or body weight? Does it make more sense?
I think it makes more sense, but I don't think it solves the entire problem of trying to predict fluid intakes. The Institute of Medicine report, when it came out in the US, was met with widespread criticism from people like Ron and others who deal with athletes or active people or physical laborers or people in hot countries or hot portions of the United States, because those fluid intakes as well as the sodium intakes that relate to them are so highly variable. So I don't think it's possible to make a recommendation for adequate fluid intake for the population. And I think those guidelines of 2.5 liters, for example, should be taken with a grain of salt, so to speak. Pardon the pun.
Because I think in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, we use 35 milliliters of water per body weight as an,
Fat-free mass would certainly be a better denominator in that equation, but as I said, I still don't think it predicts because of the physical activity differences, primarily.
We'll return to it tomorrow. Would you agree then that instead of making recommendations in terms of intake, which is what everyone does, we should recommend that if you're not passing a litre of urine, you should drink more? Which is what used to be done in the British military.
Yeah. I think urine volume and urine color both play into very practical recommendations.
Maria, you have the next question. And then Jane.
Yeah, I would like to continue on the comments from Ibrahim and Ian on how to measure sodium intake and output in the population. And I was wondering if you could give us an update of what is the current situation in the US. I think CDC and NHANES use 24-hour recalls and spot urine for sodium determination, if you know where this stands, when we are going to have first results and things like that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Methodological differences, I think, really need to be ironed out, and I don't know where those data currently stand. But I think it does go back to the fact that strategies like 24-hour urine collections and then spot checks combine to give you more valid information than either of those things would alone. So, but I can't answer your question in terms of where the state of the art currently stands with NHANES.
But is this methodology adopted currently? Is this how they do it?
Yes.
Spot urine and 24-hour recalls?
Yes.
This method could be recommended also by this group and say, so this is state of the art or something.
The intention is at the end of the discussion tomorrow, we'll try to produce a short summary of our discussions, and that can include some recommendations. And if people feel it's appropriate to put in some of those recommendations, we have the opportunity to do that. And I think we should take that opportunity. We have a lot of expertise around the table. There are some situations where we can perhaps add some qualifications on existing recommendations, and there are other situations where we might want to make some suggestions. So we should do that. Jane.
You showed some very high sodium intakes for people from Japan and China, and presumably a lot of that will be monosodium glutamate in soy sauce and whatever. Does having sodium from that source rather than sodium chloride make any difference from a health perspective?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Obviously, Japan has some of the highest sodium intakes in the world, but some of the lowest rates of hypertension. So it's certainly a possibility, but you can't delineate the possibility of the salt type and source from genetic predisposition. So we're dealing with a different genetic predisposition that evolutionarily ate a lot of fish and ate a lot of high salt in the diet. So I think it's a great point, but it shows the disparity between the notion of, for everybody, just cutting salt in the diet and all of a sudden hypertension will go away.
But other implications for acid-base status, for example, with those other anions? Because if we've got a metabolizable anion, it's going to make a difference to acid-base.
Yeah. I don't know.
And if we feed people sodium citrate or sodium acetate or sodium lactate as opposed to sodium chloride, we certainly get a shift.
You can feed it to them, but they don't like it as much.
Well,
I mean, you can feed it to them in the laboratory, you can feed it to them in prepared meals, but for the population base, we're not going to change that part of the cultural diet.
Well, if you're in situations such as the oral rehydration solution, which traditionally has a fairly high sodium content, if anything between 60 and 90 millimoles per litre, if you put that in as sodium chloride, it's almost undrinkable. Yeah. But if you put half of it in as sodium chloride and the other half in as sodium lactate or bicarbonate or acetate, it's quite tolerable. So the chloride does have a significant effect on palatability too. We shouldn't ignore it.
Right.
Ibrahim, did you have a comment?
Blood pressure is not monocausal, so to sodium and salt, because in Japan they have also, among many comparable countries, the lowest obesity rate, and they have also some other metabolic problems at much lesser extent that we have in the United States or in Europe. So I think it is not only monocausal here, so sodium and salt and blood pressure.
John Leeper.
I wonder if you can tell us about the use of isotopes for looking at things like water turnover and presumably sodium turnover in individuals, please.
I don't know. Most isotope studies have been done over short periods of time, relatively short periods of time, mostly in young, healthy individuals, young males with a predisposition toward high water turnovers, for example, exercising athletes. So for a larger population sample, I hadn't seen any large-scale studies looking at tritiated water or deuterium turnover as it predicts fluid balance and fluid turnover from a population standpoint. Others may know of those data, but I didn't see them.
What about lithium as a tracer for sodium?
Yeah, I haven't seen those studies either, at least not on a population basis. Yeah, I think that would be another answer to what becomes state-of-the-art in the future, as opposed to moving away from dietary records toward at least urinary sodium excretions, and how often and how frequently we should measure those currently.
When we look at nutrient intake, take it from dietary records, it is prone to failure and weakness unless we use a laboratory assessment as method of validation. So we always, when we describe the nutrient status, so we take the intake, but not alone, and rely much more on the outcome of the laboratory assessment. And we can take this also as valid for sodium and salt intake from dietary records. Very weak, we know that, but if we have the possibility to analyze sodium in urine, we can take this for purpose of validation.
John.
Just to go back to the question we began to discuss of what recommendations might look like if they were in terms of urine volume. And you mentioned the old military advice about 1 litre a day, but if Richard's right about the amount of urine, amount of water we need to clear solute, if we have a maximum urine osmolality of about 1,200 milliosmoles per kilo, then it's not urine volume, but it's urine volume in the context of what our solute load is, which is what matters. But my second question was the colour of the urine thing, which is something that's been discussed an awful long time. What's the evidence for that? That urine colour is a valuable... I just don't know. I mean, it's something we've all talked about, but what's the evidence?
I think, in my opinion, the evidence is fairly weak. And I think as a broad brush generalization, there's some validity across many populations or many samples of people we want to look at, that darker colored urine and accompanied by low urine volumes, for example, post-exercise, are reflective of dehydration. But because so many things, as you know, can color the urine and alter its appearance, as well as volume, I think its utility is limited. I only brought it up in the context of adding one more piece of the puzzle to the urine volume.
And urine osmolality is the standard, but most routine hospital laboratories don't measure urine osmolality. It's expensive, it's time consuming, it's not particularly difficult, but it's not done routinely. But a conductivity meter costs you about $10 in a hardware store and gives you a pretty good measure of solute content.
Mm-hmm. The electrical conducting solute.
Yeah. The urea,
Probably a good thing.
the urea doesn't show up terribly well, but if you do a correlation between the conductivity and the osmolality, it's pretty good. Susan published a paper on that, so and it's very cheap and it's very quick.
The paper or the method?
The papers, the paper. No, the paper was $50 a page charge. The paper wasn't free. Peter.
You presented very nice epidemiological results on salt sensitivity in the US population. I don't remember, maybe I just missed the method of identification of these people. My question is, if there is a microarray to identify these genetic disorders which could lead to salt sensitivity, and if you think that this could be useful to perform a population-based screening for those people to make the personal sodium need to see it and to personalize the sodium intake.
That's a very good question. I tried to make the point, and I'm sure I didn't do a very good job, that because the responses are so variable, typically to identify sodium sensitivity, a standard meal is given high in sodium, and they track blood pressure over the next several hours. And if it goes up, they are categorized as salt sensitive. However, as I tried to show in those frequency distributions, not only do some people's blood pressure go down, but some people's blood pressure go up by 5 millimeters systolic, don't change diastolically. Some people go up diastolically and don't change with respect to systolic blood pressure. And there's no fixed phenotype that differentiates one from the other. It's a variability in the response where it's very typical for a salt-sensitive individual to always respond with a blood pressure peak after eating a high salt meal, but there's no way of standardizing that that's universally acceptable. So as a screening tool, as an indicator of sodium sensitivity from which we could prescribe in a better method salt intakes, it's lacking that validity.
This microarray system couldn't be useful too?
The what system?
For genetic problems to screen them.
Well, that's most of these genetic studies have been done by comparing various genotypes to that response. But you saw the whole family of genes that show some relation to salt sensitivity. Some of them are related to the renin-angiotensin system. Some of them are related to endothelial function. Some are related to transporters in the kidney. So it would have to be a broad screen genetically for lots and lots of different markers. And I think that science is just evolving now. So I think the best answer is, I think in the future, there will be that capability. I think it just hasn't evolved to that state yet.